I'd like to tell you a bit about my life during the Second World War while I was growing up. I'd been born in Vietnam, so the story starts there. I came home when I was 6, and life was very interesting, very different there. A hot, sticky country. People led very leisurely lives because it was so hot and sticky. As a kid, I didn't know any other lifestyle. I only remember things like the very Vietnamese scenes in Saigon, going around in rickshaws and going to lovely beaches. But all that good fun had to come to an end when the Japanese threatened to invade that part of the Far East. So my mother and I escaped in 1939 on a small cargo boat. Because of the dangers of big passenger liners had stopped going to the Far East, and it was only a small cargo boat we could get. My sister was already at home in Scotland, and my father stayed behind to close down his business that he had there, building rice mills. And he came home about a year later across the Pacific and the North Atlantic. Now, when we got back home to Europe, life was very different. At sea, it was all lovely, sunshine, beautiful waves, sea breezes, relaxation. When we arrived at Le Havre in France, it was all very bleak, gloomy weather, gloomy atmosphere, everybody dressed in rather drab clothes, including my mother in an old tweed coat. I remember the crossing of the Channel to get from France to England, sleeping in a dormitory, which was a surprise experience for me. And then we got on the old steam trains that went around Britain then, and I loved the steam engines. They were noisy and emitted a vast amount of steam and soot, but the clanking noise was very exciting to a young boy. Eventually we arrived in the north of Scotland, where my mother's family had all originated, and their life was very good because there were several aunts around. We weren't living in isolation by any manner of means. Furthermore, the people in the north of Scotland lived quite well during the war, even when there was rationing, because nearly all of them had a garden big enough in which to keep some chickens, so they had a continuous supply of eggs, whereas everybody else had severe restriction on rationing. They also had fruit bushes like raspberries and blackcurrants, and we got government allowances of extra sugar to make jam, so there was no shortage of jam. They also all had a beehive, so they all got a year's supply of honey. There were farms all around, and although there was milk rationing in the cities, in the remote north there was always plenty of milk and butter and cream. Meat might have been a problem, but there were always older sheep dying, and so we lived on a lot of mutton and a lot of rabbits, not much beef. But again, really no meat rationing the way there was in the cities. However, we couldn't stay indefinitely in the north of Scotland in the old town of Tame. I had my first year at school there, and I remember that quite vividly. There were quite decent, friendly kids, and there were some very rough kids too, wearing cast-off clothes, rushing around with runny noses, beating each other up and using strong language which I'd never heard before. However, we learnt to read and do simple arithmetic there. And one interesting thing was that in those days they didn't use paper at school. We did all the work on slates with just a flat slab of slate and a slate pencil. And you could write anything on it, and then to erase it you just washed it off with a wet sponge or rag. However, they were quite keen that we should learn to write, and it was traditional that one spent hours producing copyright script, and I was almost a prize winner, but since then my writing has deteriorated to be almost illegible, sadly. After a short time, my father had to get some sort of work back in Britain. He'd been a builder of rice mills in Vietnam and had to abandon his business because of the Japanese invasion. In Britain, he might have gone back into the Air Force, which he'd been in the First War, but they persuaded him to go into the Ministry of Supply. What that ministry did was to supervised the provision of almost everything the country needed, and dare say it covered food and clothing and furniture, but for him it was the engineering side. And in particular, he was charged with getting factories to convert from producing peacetime machinery, such as printing machinery, into wartime metal products. And he took me around one particular factory, and I remember it quite vividly. They had converted from making printing machinery into making gun barrels. And no doubt throughout the whole country, lots of engineering firms had similar conversions. They didn't seem to mind that sort of work, and in particular, of course, there's a change in that a lot of the young fit men had gone off to fight in the armed forces. So much of the work was being done by women, who again seemed to like it. We found quite a nice house in Edinburgh, in the suburbs, and I went to school near there. As regards housing, the first comment I'd like to make is that as a result of the mobility of people during the war, people were always moving from one town to another in connection with their work. For instance, people were being posted here, posted there. A lot, of course, were men and women being posted into the armed forces. But every house had an inspection to see if they had any spare rooms and whether anybody could be taken in as lodgers. So we had our inspection, and we were told we could take a couple to come and live in one of our bedrooms as a bed sitting room, and it had use of the kitchen with us. And I think we had 2 separate couples over a period, and it all worked out quite well. We would have the use of the kitchen for an evening meal for 1 hour, and they would have a different hour, and it worked very amicably. But that seemed to stop after a while, I think, perhaps as everybody got settled. People worried about bombing raids during the war, and certainly Edinburgh did have a bombing raid early on. It was alleged that the Germans were trying to destroy the 4th railway bridge. I don't think they did hit it at all, and the bombing didn't come anywhere near us, but I was able to watch it out of my bedroom window at night with all the searchlights crisscrossing in the sky and shells exploding in the skies. For a little boy, of course, life wasn't anywhere near the war, really. I started off at one junior school and then went to my permanent school, which is called Watson's. I wasn't sure that I'd get in, but I seemed to manage it all right. And my first teacher was a lovely woman who had been a teacher in Canada and had come back to Britain to help the war effort, as it were. She was a very good all-round teacher and used to enchant us with all her tales of life in America. And these are the early days of cinema, when people used to watch cowboy films and cowboy and Indian battles, and she knew all about the reality of life in America and Canada. I slowly progressed up through the school. As far as I can recall, we boys were always perfectly happy with